Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Stephen Anderson and I'm an assistant conservation biologist for the Nature Conservancy of Canada in Manitoba. I'm here today on our beautiful Fort Ellice property. I've been here for the past week doing Dakota skipper surveys, but today I'm here for our Walk on the Wildflower Side event, and I'm really excited to talk about some of Manitoba's wildflowers. And before we get started, I just wanted to draw your attention to the chat feature. It should be running throughout this video, and if you have any questions, please type them in the chat and we will answer them live on air. Just to start us off, if you could type in the chat feature where you're from, we'd love to hear where everyone's listening in from. So why are we interested in wildflowers and what makes them so special? Well, they do hold a special place in my heart. I grew up on a small farm outside of Brookdale, Manitoba, and watching the wildflowers bloom on my family's pasture lands was always one of my favorite things to do in the summer. And then that continued on into my university career, where I did my honors and my master's looking at the pollination biology of the small white lady slipper. And so we're going to talk about a variety of flowers today, and we tried to pick some that are found across Manitoba or some from different parts of the province. And a lot of these flowers are currently in bloom, but some of them have finished. But hopefully you'll learn a bit, and maybe on your next hike you'll be able to spot some and recognize some. Like I said, all of these flowers are charismatic and very easy to identify, and you should be able to identify them even from a distance. So for our first flower, this is the bottle gentian or the closed gentian. This flower grows from 30 to 80 centimeters tall, which is about 1 to 2.5 feet. It likes medium to wet soils, and it'll bloom generally in the southern parts of Manitoba from August until October. And what's really cool about this flower is that it always looks like it's about to bloom. The petals always kind of stay in this closed up position, and they never open. So that's how it gets its name, closed gentian. And so how this flower gets pollinated is a bumblebee will come to the tip of the flower and kind of force the petals apart and crawl inside. Once it's inside, it's able to pollinate the flower and receive some nectar and some pollen as a reward. And this also makes sure that the flower only gets visited by insects that do a good job pollinating it. For our second flower, this is a common flower throughout Manitoba. I'm sure you recognize it. This is the black-eyed Susan. In some areas it can grow up to 150 centimeters or up to 5 feet tall. It's found across Manitoba because it likes both dry and wet conditions, so it can kind of make do anywhere. And this flower will bloom from June to October. Some neat things about this flower is if you look closely, there's a lot of hair both along the stem and on the leaves, and this helps the flower retain moisture on the dry Canadian prairies. This is also a special flower for some of our species at risk in Manitoba. I'm sure you've heard of the small butterfly, the Poweshiek skipperling, which is found in the tallgrass prairie area. And that butterfly, this is one of the main food sources for that butterfly. So making sure we have lots of black-eyed Susan around is also really important for the health of other species. The next flower is always pretty when you see it on the prairie. This is the pink-flowered onion. This is in the lily family. It's a little bit of a shorter plant. It only grows 30 to 60 centimeters, so 1 to 2 feet tall. And it'll grow from July until October. And generally when you come across this flower, the first thing you notice is the smell. It produces a really strong oniony smell. And though while this flower will produce a bulb like other onions, it grows for multiple years, and so that makes the bulb very bitter. So it's not a very tasty plant to eat. Another favorite plant we have here is the swamp milkweed. So this particular milkweed is found mostly in the tallgrass prairie area, and it likes pretty wet conditions, as the name suggests. In really wet conditions, it can grow as well up to 150 centimeters or 5 feet tall, and it'll bloom from June to August. And this plant, the milkweeds, get their name from the milky sap that they produce, which is quite toxic to humans. And I'm sure we've all heard that the monarch butterfly really likes this plant. It will only lay its eggs on milkweed plants, and then when the eggs hatch, the larvae will feed on the milkweed and ingest some of that milky sap, And so this makes monarch larvae, caterpillars, and butterflies slightly toxic, which helps keep away predators. And one of the most important things you can do to help monarchs is by planting your own milkweed. This particular plant, swamp milkweed, makes a really good garden plant because it tends to just grow where you plant it. Some other milkweed species, such as the showy or the common, when you plant them in their garden, they tend to take over. So this might be a better choice for some gardeners. The next flower is one of my favorites, as we, especially in the early prairie. It's called the three-flower Avents. This is in the rose family. And kind of similar to the bottle gentian, this flower blooms in the spring, and it doesn't open until a bee forces its way inside. And because it flowers so early in the spring, this makes it a really important food source for early season pollinators, because it's one of the few plants that they can eat at that time of year. When this plant is pollinated, it produces these really long seeds that look a little hairy. And this is where it gets its name. Also, one of its other names is prairie smoke, and that's where it gets its name. And these long hairy seeds are really great for dispersing the seeds later in the season. And one other thing about this plant is that it never loses its color. It's always green, which makes it really easy to see in the spring because it's one of the few green plants on the prairie. Next up is probably a plant you often see in ditches. This is the western red lily. As the name suggests, it's in the lily family. And it blooms from June until August. And this plant is typically pollinated by swallowtail butterflies and hummingbirds. And one interesting note, if you see an orange or red flower, that probably means it's a butterfly or bird pollinated plant. Bees, they're missing a photoreceptor in their eyes, so they actually can't see red the way you and I do, but butterflies and birds are able to see red properly. So red flowers typically mean that they're pollinated by either birds or butterflies. The next plant here is the columbine. This plant grows 90 centimeters or 3 feet tall. And it produces these long tubular flowers that always kind of look like they're hanging upside down. It generally blooms in spring and summer and typically stops blooming around July. What's really neat about this plant, and part of what makes it so noticeable, is it has these really long spikes at the back of the flower. These are what are called nectar spurs, and inside each of these little bulbs is some nectar. And so because these flowers are so tubular, only pollinators with long tongues, such as a hummingbird, a butterfly, maybe some long-tongued bees, they're the only really pollinators that can actually reach to the end of this tube to get the nectar. So this has made it a very specialized flower for what kind of pollinators it attracts. Another one of my favorites, I'm pretty sure all of these have been my favorite so far, is the scarlet paintbrush. Sometimes you will see this in a white or orange variety as well. And it gets its names because it has these really pretty tips on its flowers that look like they've been dipped in a paintbrush. It's typically found in meadows and open forest. You can find a lot of these near Riding Mountain as well. What's kind of neat about this plant is it's a hemiparasite, so meaning it's partially parasitic. So it'll usually be found next to a host plant, and its roots will kind of dig into that plant and it'll leach water and nutrients from that plant as well, which kind of makes it a unique little plant. And this plant is usually blooming from May until August in Manitoba. And then finally, we can't really talk about wildflowers in Manitoba without talking about the prairie crocus. This is generally one of the first flowers you'll see in the spring. And it's really well adapted to blooming so early. You'll see that the petals and the stem are super hairy, which help it trap the heat. And what's really neat is the flowers of the prairie crocus will actually follow the sun throughout the sky. And the reflective hairs and sepals will help trap heat inside the flower. And so this flower serves as an important food source early in the season for bees, but also it attracts bees because the flower is so warm. Sometimes bees and other insects will get inside this flower and will be able to warm up in the cold prairie air. So that's all the flowers I had for you today. Like I said, it was just a brief overview. I'd love to hear what your favorite wildflowers are in the comments. And so I just wanted to finish off by noting that Fort Ellice and some of our other nature destinations are open in Manitoba. We have 4. You can find out about our nature destinations at naturedestinations.ca. We do ask that when you visit our properties, you respect physical distancing and keep up to date on our website for any special measures. When you do go out on your next nature adventure, we would love it if you would hashtag Take5WithNature, so that we can follow along with your cool nature adventures. And then finally, our work at NCC helps to conserve all of these flowers and their neighboring plants and all the pollinators that serve them. And if you would like to support NCC, please consider making a donation at natureconservancy.ca and clicking on the Donate Now button. I've really enjoyed being able to talk with you out here on Fort Ellice. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thank you very much and have a great day.